Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton. The U.S. orbital launch capacity is in danger of falling seriously behind demand. That's the premise of a recently released report, Scrubbed, America's Launch Capacity Challenge. The report, commissioned by the Commercial Space Federation, is a deep dive on that potential shortfall and what policymakers, operators, and investors need to do about it before it's too late. My guest on this edition of the Journal of Space Commerce podcast is Dr. Tom Colvin, co-founder, managing partner, and chief technologist at Rational Futures, the Washington, D.C.-based research and advisory firm that produced the report for the CSF. And Tom, thanks for joining me on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me. It is wonderful to meet another long-haired Tom. So,
and there aren't too many of us left in the world, I don't think. In any event, let's talk about you for just a minute first. What was the event that caused you to leave NASA and strike out on your own?
Well, so maybe should give a tiny bit of background about me getting to NASA.
Okay.
I'll skip a lot of my my origin story where I was sort of like a lost kid in high school. I basically just wanted to skateboard and play guitar all day. But eventually I realized I had to go to college, and so went to Ohio State for physics, Stanford Aerospace for my Ph.D. And then I immediately came to government because I wanted to sit in a position where instead of helping just like one company to, maybe like make a better seatbelt for their capsule or make a better valve for their rocket, I wanted to create an ecosystem where everyone can understand what the opportunities are, and smart people can get money to do good things. So I came to DC. I was at USAID for a bit, DoD for a bit, and then I spent a good amount of time at a place called the Science Technology Policy Institute. It's they do analysis for predominantly the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, and also stuff for other federal agencies as well. And while there, I got a sense for, one, how to do work that is both technical and that supports policy and that also brings in an economic aspect. And in doing that sort of work, I build a reputation for myself as someone who can kind of quantify anything, or oftentimes the things that people say are impossible or unquantifiable, I'll do it. And so I got poached to come to NASA, basically to do that very thing related to risks for orbital debris. That's where a lot of my space work, my reputation is estimating in dollars the risks to operators from interacting with orbital debris, and then also estimating in dollars the sort of the cost effectiveness of all the different things that you could do to mitigate those risks. So then, that's sort of like how I got to NASA, what I was doing at NASA. And then in early 2025, NASA did a relatively small reduction in force, but that included my office and the Office of the Chief Economist group, with whom I worked very, very closely. And we all really liked working together, and we're friends, and we also all together had this same kind of value proposition of being able to quantify things, especially economic things that other people thought were too hard. And as you probably know, once you lose the team, right, like you never get it back, right? And so we thought, well, what we can do is really unique and valuable, and we don't want to lose it. And so we created Rational Futures, which is a techno-economic analysis and advisory firm, where now we can help clients in the government, U.S., international, private sector, doesn't matter. We can help everyone in the space sector, and hopefully also broader deep tech sectors, to understand how their technologies and the economics of those technologies and future markets work. So that's sort of, how we got here, and, why we left.
Something else we have in common. I thought I was going to be a rock star too.
Thanks. Maybe I should have told you my story about I moved to Germany, the mecca of metal, but I'll save that for later.
Well, we'll do that one over a beer one of these days. Uh,
Awesome.
let's talk about the report a little bit. What did the Commercial Space Federation commission? Why did they commission this report? What did they see that said this was an issue?
Yeah, so right now, launch and launch volumes, like how much we're sending up, how frequently, launch capacity, whether our spaceports can handle that volume of launch. It's a big issue right now. The commercial side of folks are talking about it a lot. The government is doing a lot of things to try to address it. And so right now, operators, they're experiencing friction at the current launch cadence. The predictions for future launches are, kind of off the charts, and nobody knows really like what's the capacity of even our existing infrastructure, or when we'll hit that capacity limit, what's the biggest bang for the buck to fix it. And so we were taking a first sort of stab at making a much more rigorous, physically grounded and traceable analysis that people who are trying to plan for future infrastructure can use. Because if you're going to build new infrastructure, you want it to be right sized to the amount of demand or services that you're going to have to provide. So
Well,
that was effectively what we were doing. We can bring in, we pitched that we can also bring in certain technical constraints that we haven't seen other people address, and then qualitatively we can characterize like where are the pain points on the ground when it comes to like launch operations on the ground, and then also try to figure out what are potential actions to address those things. So that was kind of the genesis there.
you talk about the infrastructure, and the NASA OIG just released a report finding that the Kennedy Space Center is still running on 1960s Apollo era infrastructure, and it's not pretty. It's in some places it's crumbling, and some people have said falling apart. What does this change in your capacity projections of you talked about 180 launches per year? Is that feasible given the current infrastructure?
Well, so 180 launches per year is what we saw from all US spaceports in 2025. And I mean, if you want to we give a bunch of different scenarios
Mhm.
for, so before I can tell you like how that sort of changes, right? Like we come up with what do people actually want to launch? And so we name the satellites, and with each of those, we know how many, we know what inclinations, what mass, everything. Um, and so then from those, we build launch manifests to give us a sense for how many launches might it take to satisfy that demand for satellites. In our like most, I don't even know if you want to call it optimistic, but the most aggressive, the most intense scenario, you could wind up seeing like 7,000 launches per year in a scenario where you believe that there will be over 1 million orbital data centers in space, right?
Right.
Now, we don't vouch for like whether orbital data centers in space will work out or whether these other constellations will actually materialize, but we were pulling from FCC documents, which they regulate uh, the orbital debris plans and things like that of space actors. And so from that, from filings to a regulator, we were able to pull out all of the parameters that we use to build our scenarios. In other scenarios that we have run, you see, maybe even like less than 100 launches per year, right? So it really depends on the assumptions that you're making. To the point about what changes from the new NASA OIG report, one of the things that they did that I thought was a bit interesting is that they actually, it was a little bit of the executive summary makes it sound like a stronger claim than they make it sound later, but they try to pinpoint 2028, 2029 is when they say the Cape KSC may be bumping up against capacity issues and
Right.
possibly be like too stressed. The way they did that was a relatively simple argument. So they basically said that any launch, whether it like successfully went off or just was aborted, and you have to try again the next day, um, or any tanking event like where you just test things, that consumes a full day. And so you can only do one a day. And so then, they sort of tally up how many of those things there are for every launch. You can, there were like 90 some launches and like 150 some total like launch aborts and launch actual, getting fired off and tanking events. So that's a ratio of like 1.6, right? Like total events to actual number of launches. And so you can sort of see what they did is they said 365 days in a year divided by 1.6, that gives you about 220 or so like launch days. And then, that's what you wind up seeing, they're predicting in like 2028, 2029. So they just did some really, I think, like napkin math to kind of get there. It's a really interesting way to go about it. That's one way to do it. But if you look at 2025 data, there were 7 days where the Cape KSC complex did 2 launches in a single day. That's about 15% of the total launches that, 14 launches total. That's about 14% of their launches, 15% of their launches. So it is clearly possible to do multiple launches per day. And so if it is possible to do multiple launches per day, then that really changes when you're going to hit capacity. So that is all just to say that they made some interesting assumptions. They put some really good detail into what some of the ground infrastructure could be. But what we were trying to do is more on the how much do people want to launch? And then it's up to the decision makers to say, well, we believe certain scenarios, we believe certain assumptions. And that gives you a sense for how many launches of how many types of vehicles people need to plan for.
So then how do those policymakers and even investors avoid making the mistake of confusing regulatory filings with real demand? Because a Part 25 application doesn't really equal a satellite on the launch pad.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. The way that we try to deal with that here is by, as I sort of said, providing a range of different values for how many launches may happen and specifically how many satellites people might want to launch. And so we construct a few different scenarios. One scenario is if you've applied to Part 25 and been approved by the FCC, you're in what we're calling scenario A, right? So I don't want to say that makes you necessarily more credible than things that are coming later, but at least you're further down that process. You're further along than someone who, say, has applied to the FCC Part 25 but isn't yet approved. And that's our scenario B. We add in all the folks who've applied but aren't yet approved. And then scenario C, this has the data centers in them, right? So if you believe the data centers are going to happen, then we'll give you a scenario for that. And we give these like ranges of values based on those different scenarios. So by not giving one specific number, we hope to mitigate the risk that someone will like look at this and think, oh yeah, just because it was in the Part 25 application, it is necessarily going to come to fruition. We're showing a range of things. And also, just like remember the LEO broadband boom in say like the late 90s. A lot of different companies were proposing, for the time, very large constellations, and then every single one of them went bankrupt. Only one of them sort of managed to also turn their bankruptcy around and survive to become like a successful, thriving company. That was Motorola's spinoff Iridium, right? So I think just also highlighting that, the business case for some of these things is yet unproven. And just because someone has applied to the FCC or a regulator doesn't mean that they will necessarily do exactly the thing that they applied. People update their applications all the time. Companies cancel their constellations. It happens.
So then what are they miscalculating? What do you think the mistakes are that are being made?
So to me, I guess I would say that I don't know that I would say people are necessarily miscalculating. On the one hand, if you just take anyone at their word, you're only getting, sort of part of the story. And so I think people do need to recognize that there is a substantial amount of uncertainty associated with projections about the future, especially anything beyond 5 years. And so this is, again, why I try to explore ranges. The thing that I think was really missing, and so it's not necessarily miscalculating, but maybe just the community was missing a level of rigor that allows for, I think, a more like a good discussion of details. So a lot of times, I won't necessarily name names, but we see in some like government projections of future launch, it's not clear where those numbers came from, right? Like literally, what satellites are they assuming that they were launching? What vehicles were they assuming they were being launched on, etc. And without that like traceability, it becomes difficult to really grapple with the parts of the problem that make it difficult. Like you can't launch to any orbit from any launch site, right? Like certain
Right.
launch sites have launch azimuth constraints. You can't get there. You can't get to highly inclined orbits easily without an incredible dogleg from, say, the Cape and Kennedy. Likewise, you can throw less mass to orbit the higher up your altitude is, or the higher the inclination is. And all of these technical details, they wind up mattering when it comes to thinking about what's the capacity at certain sites. And so we have in our write-up, I think, just about enough. And if it's not fully enough, then, that's maybe our bad for missing a detail or two, but pretty much enough that someone should be able to pick it up and basically reproduce our analysis, right? And so that's sort of the hope here, is that it lays everything out bare so that way people can understand what the range of demand for launch is.
My guest on this edition of the Journal of Space Commerce podcast is Dr. Tom Colvin, managing partner at Rational Futures. After the break, non-traditional spaceports, including some at sea. Stay with us.
You're listening to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast from Xterra Media. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication to offer in-depth coverage of the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.
Welcome back to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton, and I'm talking with Dr. Tom Colvin, managing partner at Rational Futures. Tom, what are considered to be non-traditional launch sites?
So there's no official definition for that. In our analysis, we effectively said that a traditional launch site is anything that is either operated by the federal government or highly dependent on the federal, government, like the existing ranges. And so that would be things like KSC in the Cape, Wallops, and Vandenberg. But then other sites that are maybe like inland sites, or they are sea-based sites, would be considered more non-traditional. They may not benefit from all of the services that the federal ranges provide, and they have a different set of challenges also than what we see at the traditional sites that tend to be coastal.
Would Starbase count in that category, even though it very much looks like a traditional launch site?
So that is, it depends whether you want to call it traditional or non-traditional. It is not a federal site. My understanding is that it does benefit from some range services, but it's also not like a spaceport. And so, indeed, it's a launch site because things launch there, but it's not a launch site or a spaceport because it's a single tenant facility. And so that winds up like they don't have to go through the licensing that a spaceport that's going to try to do multi-tenant ops has to. So, it's kind of up to you whether you want to include it there. But, the future for them, we see them like instead of Starbase, we see SpaceX pursuing a lot of, launch licenses at a federal range anyways, right? So it's not clear to me exactly how that'll be used in the future. I think it
But
will
then you
be.
have,
It's just,
yeah. But then you have a lot of things like the horizontal launch sites. I'm thinking of Cecil Spaceport here in Jacksonville, Spaceport America out in New Mexico, those kinds of places. Those are, uh, they're called launch sites, and yet something's flying the rocket into space before it, or into the air before it launches.
yeah. So we would consider those non-traditional launch sites, and air-based launch, fine. And in a sense, the airplane is the first stage, right? Like that's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, in some sense, it's a little bit non-traditional. On the other hand, I mean, Pegasus, like we saw lots of these launches in the past, so it's clearly been done. It's clearly possible, but they are, non-traditional in the sense that, especially if you get to like Spaceport America or things like Midland, they are still working toward being able to do vertical launch to orbit. And our focus here was really vertical launch to orbit. We didn't look at suborbital. We didn't look at, sort of horizontal takeoff, horizontal landing. We didn't look at air launch. So we were more focused on the vertical stuff. So non-traditional from a vertical perspective.
And when you consider those non-traditional sites, is it going to be mostly the commercial market that sustains them? And is that a plausible scenario for there to be enough commercial activity to sustain those non-traditional sites?
So, again, like, let's just make sure that it's clear that we scoped ourselves to vertical launch to orbit.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So not really talking about, what the market might be for suborbital or point to point or the air launch sort of stuff. It could be in the future that there's a market for these things. However, what we found from talking to a number of operators and launch site operators as well, so launch operators and launch site operators, is that there doesn't appear to be a commercial demand for it right now or in the very near future that would lead, in a sense, like the market to create these things, right? So if you want inland launch, that is a thing that most likely the market is not going to provide. And if the government values it, they will have to support it. So two just kind of like anecdotes around that is that we did not see smaller launch providers saying that they are feeling sufficiently stressed at the traditional sites that they would find it, like that they would have to move to a non-traditional site. Um, on kind of the other hand, we do see some of the launch providers holding leases for pads at the Cape. When I say the Cape, I mean KSC and Cape Canaveral Space
Sure.
Force Center together. We see people holding licenses there for pads and stuff, but then building their infrastructure at the Mars Wallops facilities. So, there's a little bit of a question of, well, if they held, like, why did they build there instead of down at the Cape? And so it could be because they wanted to avoid the headaches associated with, being in a much more crowded area. So on the one hand, we don't see people necessarily wanting to move away from these sites. On the other hand, everyone does recognize that there's friction right now, and operators do have some incentives to try to avoid that. But if the government values the resilience and the added capacity that could potentially come with a non-traditional site, it seems like for the moment, the market isn't going to provide it and the government would have to step up.
So it's almost like hedging their bets to be able to have things in more than one spot just in case.
Indeed, indeed. And so that is in general, like, the argument for, in a sense, resilience or having a more robust posture. And it is, notoriously difficult in any industry to get people to pay for, resilience in a sense, because, if you pay a lot of money and then you don't wind up needing it, right? It's like you may think, well, I didn't need it, but no, like because you had it, you were able to still do the mission. Maybe that's not the most eloquent way to say it, except to say it's hard to get people to pay for tail risks as well, right? You
Yeah.
don't see it very often. So,
What's going to be the role of these so-called ultra class vehicles?
so in our work, the ultra class vehicles were things, we modeled 5 different launch vehicle categories.
Hmm.
I'm pulling up 4 fingers. I meant 5. Um, And so these go from as big as the ultra class vehicles, which could throw 100 metric tons to orbit at once, to as small as the micro class vehicles, which can throw maybe 300 kilograms to orbit at once.
Hmm.
Um, so, the role of the ultra, and, you could even throw in like the heavy class types of vehicles, is, we see many companies, especially as you start to get out to the data center type of future, or some of
Hmm.
the more higher power direct to cell satellite constellations. We see people talking about launching very, very large individual satellites, 2.5 to 3 metric tons per, and talking about launching thousands, possibly even a million of them in individual constellations. And so that's going to mean that if those companies actually do wind up building satellites that large and do wind up trying to launch satellites in those numbers, that you would need some of these really, really large vehicles in the ultra and the heavy classes. And one of the the issues about that, and some people are starting to recognize it, is that the presence of these vehicles and the higher cadences means that counting launches is not really the best way to think about capacity of our sites, because one launch of one of these like heavy or ultra type vehicles
Hmm.
puts a much different level of stress on our launch infrastructure than one launch of a smaller type of vehicle. So I think the ultra and the increased launch cadences of the heavies will make people have to grapple with that just counting launches is really not going to be the way to think about capacity in the future.
What's going to be the effect of potential demand from the Department of War, not only on the traditional launch sites, and I know they have several things that are like Space Force bases that are dedicated for the most part to Department of War launches, but what about on the non-traditional sites as well?
Yeah, so it's I would say, from the people that we spoke with and the materials that we've been able to see, the Department of War demand for non-traditional launch sites is ambiguous, right?
Hmm.
On the one hand, we see some of their recent planning documents where they're talking about, in the early 2030s, it seems like they're saying almost like 200 or so national security launches per year from both the eastern and western ranges. And that's a pretty big step up from, the types of launch cadences that we would see, in the past, and even like right now with NSSL phase 3, which, ballpark is probably going to come in at like 20 launches per year. So we're seeing a big increase there in national security launches potentially. But how that translates into non-traditional launch sites, frankly, nobody really knows. It sounds like that the DoD has some demand for responsive launch, being able to launch quickly, resilient launch, right? Like if the site goes down, right, like you don't want that to mean that you can't launch anymore. um, but things like resilient launch, and in some sense the responsive and resilient launch, those are almost more like purely defense value propositions. Like you're not really going to see probably NASA or NOAA be like, we need to launch within 72 hours, right? uh, And I think you also may not necessarily see that same level of being willing to pay for launch resiliency. So if the DOW does have a demand for non-traditional launch sites, they need to start to spell that out, specifically what types of satellites. And I don't mean to get into the functions because that would be
Right.
at a level, but roughly, are we talking really big things like many tons? Are we talking a couple 300-kilogram satellites? Because that gives a sense for what the vehicles are, which like types of azimuths do they want to hit? Because different inland launch sites, at least, would not be able to hit every possible orbit. And so, like, DoD just would need to put some real meat, I think, behind what their potential demand would be. So that way, people on the launch side and on the launch, like the spaceport side, could start to build, I guess, like business cases and value propositions around that.
Just a couple of things more, Tom. And one of these kind of almost deals with politics. What realistic policy actions need to happen in the next 18 months before there's a change in administration? Because the administration will change in 18 months. And we all know that different people come in with different ideas about what needs to be done about space.
Yeah. I guess I would say, I haven't really tried to look at this through the lens of one administration versus another. If what you're interested in are things that might be relatively quick, then I think, this is like, well, what are sort of the easier things that could be done?
Right.
Um, One of the challenges that we heard, especially about the traditional launch sites, is that there's not a whole lot of clarity or transparency in terms of how shared infrastructure and commodities get used. So, for example, everybody needs what's called like payload processing. So before, you're going to stick your payload on the rocket, like you've got to do some checkout stuff, you integrate it with other bits. That's a bottleneck for a number of folks. And scheduling, like who's going to use what when, is something that people don't have a great, um, it's more ad hoc, like email to email. Same
Right.
thing with, say, like using roads or, getting, propellant from the on-base propellant providers or other types of consumables, pressurants, etc. So if you and I are coordinating via email about, when my launch vehicle is going to, use this infrastructure with, and when yours is, that's great. Like you and I now are coordinated, but because we did that via email, nobody else knows what's going on, right? And so one of the easy things that everyone was pointing out was having some kind of centralized scheduling platform for people to basically negotiate and then telegraph to everyone, when they would use different types of shared resources. And, that includes payload processing, that includes roads, that includes pressurants and propellants and all of that. So just some form of like operations transparency there would be a big one, and hopefully a relatively quick one. Other kinds of quick ones are things like um, releasing at least portions of some, say, like Space Force hazard models for, say, calculating aircraft hazard areas. Right now, my understanding is that Space Force generates aircraft hazard areas, which keep aircraft safe in the event that there's an off-nominal event during a launch or reentry. It sort of like creates a big no-fly zone, right?
Right.
Where all the debris might possibly be. And so, it's wonderful that Space Force is doing that for folks, but people would like the ability to be able to see a bit more detail about how those algorithms, like what those algorithms are and how they get run, so that way they could try to use that insight to improve the operations of their own launches and potentially reduce the risk associated with their own launches. So there are these types of data sharing things. We go into, and those are just two examples. We go into a number more in the report, but kind of the big takeaway is that, like, yes, we do need new physical infrastructure, but a lot of the biggest bang for the buck is operational. And so
Yeah.
those are some relatively quick wins.
And just one thing more, what, in your opinion, does the U.S. launch structure look like in 2030? And there's going to be a lot of things happening with the deorbit of ISS and hopefully the launch of private space stations. A lot more communication satellites are going. What does that infrastructure look like in that short of a term? And is there one particular thing that has to go right for that future to materialize?
So this is a challenging question. I appreciate it. We did not try to predict what things might look like on the launch infrastructure side in 2030. Just like thinking it through in terms of the physical infrastructure. I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but it may not look that much different from now, right?
Mhm.
Like if you were to assume that an agency is able to, say, program some money that they may already have appropriated for FY27, then to build some big piece of infrastructure, like there'd be a solicitation and an award. Maybe you get there within a year, at least a year to build it. This puts us into 29, right? So like by 2030, the physical infrastructure, like hopefully we'll be making good progress on it, but it may not look that much different. This gets to kind of what I was saying a minute ago, where a lot of folks, at least with the traditional launch sites, the biggest bang for the buck could come from improving operations on existing infrastructure. So hopefully we will see something like that. As I mentioned before, there were 7 days in 2025 where the Cape was able to support 2 launches in a day. About 15% of the launches that they did overall. Could we get that up to, like 100% of launches are going 2 times a day? Like, I don't know. No one we spoke with knows. But there's sort of a sense that operational changes might be able to get us there. And then I think just kind of like high level framing, like what has to go right is that I think people need to realize that it's not about how many launches are going, but in a sense, like how big the launches are and actually getting down into the nitty gritty of how do you supply like electricity through a grid to the processing plants on the base that help people refine their liquid natural gas into methane, or, like really getting into those nitty gritties of delivering infrastructure, and then recognizing, each launch vehicle is different and is going to stress the infrastructure in different ways. So I think once we can start to move away from just counting launches to getting into those details, like that's already like one really, really big step that's necessary.
Well, the full report is available for download from the Commercial Space Federation, and we'll include that link in the information we have online. Dr. Coleman, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation. I really appreciate your insight and your time.
Thanks, Tom. This was a lot of fun. Great to meet you, and I do hope we get to talk about your heavy metal years at some point.
I was more of a 3-chord rock and roll guy. I was in the 70s. So,
Good. I'm good.
Dr. Tom Colvin. Dr. Tom Colvin is co-founder, managing partner, and chief technologist at Rational Futures. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
The Journal of Space Commerce podcast is a production of Xterra Media. The executive producers are Mike Turner and Tom Patton, with production assistance from Debbie Turner. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication systematically covering the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.